pushed from one specialist to another. And it's like, okay, I'm done with the gut. All the other symptoms that you're dealing with, go to the next specialist. And it's like, but the gut has a nervous system and the gut has immune function and the gut has all of these there's no separation in the body. And the specialist model really becomes problematic when you segment everything, because then there's no one that's really looking at the entirety of it all.
If you're a healthcare provider tired of just treating symptoms and ready to dig deeper into the root causes of health issues, the Vibrant Wellness Podcast is for you. With insider tips, expert interviews, and the latest in biotech research, this podcast will take your patient care to the next level. All right, thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Jen Rivas. I'm here with my talented and esteemed co-host, Dr. Emmy Brown. And today we have a very special guest with us, Kerri Louati, a registered dietitian, certified diabetes educator, and a specialist in chronic disease management. She's here to talk about a topic that affects us all, the link between stress, trauma, and chronic disease. So let's jump right in. Thank you, Kerri, for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, we are so pumped about this topic. And I always just kind of like to start because I love to hear about how our guests got to the place they are today. So I think it kind of helps make a connection with our listeners, and it really validates your expertise in your niche. So if you can, share with us how you got started down this path to being an integrative and functional dietitian.
So I started down this path about I would say 20 years ago. I became interested in this field because my grandmother was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she turned to alternative means to heal herself and keep herself in remission for over 20 years. So I became really fascinated with nutrition and energy medicine and so many alternative modalities that are not commonly offered in the conventional medicine world. And so that took me down a little journey, and here I am today.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Well, I want to start, if you don't mind, if you'll indulge me, a question about myself, and I think it might apply to a lot of people. When I was in my 20s and again in my 30s, I had two major anxiety attacks. One so bad that I actually had to rush myself my dad did, to the ER because I thought I was dying of a heart attack. The crazy thing is, if you were to ask me, if I was a stressed person, I would have laughed it off. I kind of felt like I was very even keeled. Nothing really bothered me. So help me understand what stress is per your definition. And like I said, I'm assuming many others probably deal with this. How could I so grossly misread my body's signs?
I'm sorry that happened to you. And it's such a good question because there's so many different factors that affect stress on the body. And it kind of creeps up on us until all of a sudden it's just a big burden and we become symptomatic. But stress really plays a fundamental role in a lot of chronic conditions. I mean, anxiety and panic attacks are one. But it really affects every system in the body. It affects the cardiovascular system. It affects immune imbalances, hormones. It can definitely affect our guts. And so, when we're dealing with stress, our whole body is really affected. And stress is really just a disruption in our homeostasis in the body. And this can be due to a lot of factors. This can be due to environmental reasons, physical reasons, psychological reasons. And that eventually leads to some different responses in the body to allow us to deal with that stress and try to regain that homeostasis. And this is essentially a good thing. We want our body to be able to deal with stress in acute situations. Sometimes it can be a bit much of a response and, land people in the ER with a panic attack. But really, it's the chronicity of the problem that is what tends to lead to a lot of these symptoms. So, we can dive a little bit into some of the factors that lead to stress. And I think a lot of people tend to, be very aware of some of the emotional or psychological causes, things like financial stress or dealing with, a difficult boss or a really stressful job. Maybe you're having relationship trouble or dealing with a divorce. Maybe it's a global pandemic and we're all, dealing with something brand new that no one's ever managed before. So a lot of psychological
Mm.
stressors can play a really big role. But then we also have physical stressors. And, oftentimes it's this accumulation of all of these different stressors on the body. But if you take a look at physical stressors, you can see things like sleep deprivation or circadian rhythm disruption. So maybe someone's working the night shift and they're not getting a really good night's sleep. Different exposure to pathogens. These are things like infections from viruses or fungi, yeast, Borrelia, Bartonella. I mean, you could go on and on with all the different infections that can contribute to stress. Different toxins. Maybe, you're exposed to mold or heavy metals or environmental toxins, endotoxins coming
Mm.
from the gut. And then we have other random factors like EMS, electromagnetic fields from Wi Fi or power lines or all of our devices that are constantly on and we're exposed to. And then, of course, the diets and other lifestyle factors. So, I read a very long list of all these different factors. And sometimes it's really that perfect storm that someone's dealing with that, there's just a combination of all these things that can really lead to your bucket just overflowing of stress. And that can, make someone really symptomatic. Not sure if any of
I
those
love what you
happened on
said
that
about
day.
No, I actually love what you said about the disruption of the homeostasis. I think that just covers everything, right? And the tipping point, you alluded to a bucket, it just makes a lot of sense. And honestly, if I were to go back to those moments in time, definitely like a lot of things that you said, moving, financial stress, all of that was right at the surface. So it makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's one of those things that, focusing on stress, this is such a big topic and it's so easy for us to say like, oh, manage your stress and decrease the stress in your life. And it's so much harder to do than to just talk about. So it's very easy to become overwhelmed. We're constantly burdened in our society from every which angle with stressors. So we really need to take a proactive stance to try to minimize the impact it has on our body.
Yeah, absolutely.
You touched on so many things, Kerri, and really, it's several body systems, and a lot of it can stem from psychological stress. So,
Mm.
also, hello, I wanted to welcome you before we jump into further questioning and really getting to the root of that psychological stress. I believe many providers at this point are familiar with ACEs or adverse childhood experiences. So these are potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood. And it's one of the most recognized forms of trauma. According to the CDC, they're common. About 61% of adults surveyed across 25 states reported they had experienced at least one type of ACE before age 18, and nearly 1 in 6 reported that they had experienced 4 or more types of ACEs. So, and preventing ACEs could potentially reduce many health conditions also. For example, by preventing ACEs, up to 1.9 million heart disease cases and 21 million depression cases could have been potentially avoided. And that's from CDC. And so
That's staggering.
it's staggering, and really we can't ignore this. I don't think we talk about it enough. And so that's why I'm so excited that you are up to speed on this, and I'm really wanting to jump into the exciting topic at hand that you are hoping to fill us in on. And what are you researching currently?
Well, I just want to kind of mention that the staggering statistics, and it really just goes to show how significant of an impact trauma has on the body and the long-lasting effects that trauma has on the body. It's not often something that someone just endures and then gets over. The body remembers, the cells remember this trauma, and it really takes a proactive measures to get out of that state of trauma. And, it's really interesting when you look at some of the changes that happen in the body, changes in the brain and, changes in the nervous system. And so that's been something really interesting. And, that really, I love that the segue, because one of the things I've been super passionate about researching recently falls under this category of trauma, but really medical trauma. In my private practice, I work with a lot of pediatric patients that have some level of trauma, whether it's being in the NICU as a premature infant, or dealing with a brain injury, or, some other, multiple surgeries often for a lot of these kids. And, so they're experiencing trauma on a different level. And it's really difficult working with children that are experiencing this level of stress and this level of trauma, because you can't really tell a 1-year-old to just like sit and meditate for 20 minutes and get out of their state of trauma. I mean, it doesn't really work that way. So I've been, super passionate about looking for ways to help rebalance the nervous system after these traumatic events for children and infants, and ways and different devices and different tools that children can use to help kind of snap that nervous system back into a state of regulation and homeostasis, and allow their body to thrive. And as we continue today talking about a lot of the effects of stress and trauma on the body, we really see this in a lot of these patients, whether they're pediatric patients or patients dealing with chronic illness, that it really is affecting the whole body. It's affecting the gut. It's affecting, the immune system. And so, really giving people the tools to allow them to deal with the stress is really, really important. So that's been a really big area of focus for me. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that I've discovered, but it's really exciting in this field. I think there's a lot of interest and a lot of progress happening in this area.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I can't wait to hear about that. And I'm wondering too, I imagine a lot of environmental factors will impact folks when they're dealing with these stressors after a traumatic event. And so now that we have a basic understanding of how the body responds to stress, what can we do about it that is in our control? For example, many practitioners are also familiar with the term epigenetics, meaning beyond genetics. So, for example, dietary, lifestyle, environmental, mental, emotional aspects of life that can impact the expression of our genes. Of course, we cannot change our genes, but we may be able to impact the expression of our gene with epigenetics. So, thinking about environmental stressors, for example, what are some environmental stressors? Can you speak to what these are? And what are oftentimes some misconceptions that you hear about environmental toxins and environmental medicine overall?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And it's such a big topic, exposure to toxicity, because toxins are everywhere. When we look at our environment, we find them in our air, in our water, in our food, in our homes. I mean, our homes can be more toxic indoors than outdoors because of so much off gassing from volatile organic compounds. And really, it's not a matter today of whether we're being exposed to toxins. It's really, the question is, how toxic are we, and how much is that impacting our health? That's really the better question to ask. And so certain things, are more difficult for us to control. We can't control our outdoor air quality. We can't control if we're going for a run and we're being exposed to car exhaust. Um, but there are a lot of things we can control. And, we can make better choices with exposure to chemicals in our food, choosing organic food and reducing our exposure to, different herbicides like glyphosate, which we know is a toxin that's prevalent, has a really big impact on gut health. And, it's something that is even found in our organic foods as well. that's how prevalent it is. Other pesticides that we might use around the home, around the garden, or also found in other foods. I mean, these are things that we can definitely take steps to avoid. And then filtering our water. Water quality is probably one of the biggest sources of toxins. And I know a lot of people might take some extra effort to filter their water. But, we might get exposure bathing in a bath for 20 minutes a day or a few times a week and, be absorbing a great amount of toxins that way. But it's a threat. And our body treats toxic exposure as a stress response. It's something that really pushes our body into a state of protection. It really feels like it needs to protect ourselves from that stress. So, there's a lot of misconceptions out there too. I think one of the things that I really, it's not probably the most popular opinion, but the concept of the dose is the poison. And that's such a, common saying and argument against toxins in functional medicine, but we really don't look at the additive effect of toxins or someone's, genetic bioindividuality with their ability to detox. And get rid of some of these toxins or their excretion capabilities. I mean, there's so many factors that go into that. So I'd say that's something that I'd probably isn't the most popular opinion, but I'd love to kind of, address that common saying.
Well, it begs the question, I have to know, how do you filter your water? What do you use?
That's such a good question. I don't know that I've encountered anything perfectly. I love drinking Mountain Valley spring water. And I also do have a Berkey, even though that's kind of, I don't know, they've been under fire recently with maybe not being as good quality as they have advocated for. But down the road, I think I'd invest in a reverse osmosis filter. That's probably one of the better gold standards for water.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yeah. And what
Yeah.
about, so and even you mentioned pesticides and, I wonder the stubbornness that comes from people maybe when they're a little bit hesitant to learn about environmental medicine, maybe they think they're using a natural pesticide. Is there such a thing? They're trying to keep their garden pretty and pest free. What
So
can they do?
funny
A
story,
real thing?
actually. So I was actually in the process of writing the environmental toxin guide, and I get a knock on my door, and there's a gentleman there who's, he's a salesman. I can tell he's trying to sell me something, but I'm entertaining him. And he's like, I just started to spray your neighbors' yards, but I have this new eco-friendly, non-toxic pesticide that I started to use. And, because I had told him I'm not interested. I'm this is a non-toxic household. And, he starts, giving me the whole spiel. No, this is really good. I'm like, I'm so sorry, but you knocked on the wrong house. And I start spilling off all of the facts that are really associated with this pesticide. Needless to say, he left and did not come back.
Give you an ingredient list? That's what I would be wondering if we could see what was actually in what he was selling.
No, and the truth is, the pesticide that he's talking about is derived from chrysanthemum. So it can be derived from natural sources, but that doesn't mean, I mean, we all know, right? Like natural doesn't always mean it doesn't impact the body negatively.
Right.
So, that's the case. That's one example here.
Exactly. Naturally derived is not the same thing as non-toxic.
Absolutely.
I think that's really
Funny how
important.
marketing can use those words to spin their agenda. So, buyer beware, we have to educate ourselves. So,
yeah. And not take, everyone's word for it. And to really do our own research and to look into things ourselves. And I know that's such a heavy thing to say because, doing research these days can sometimes be a bit of a chore. But to just really be educated and to understand, what you're putting on your body, what you're putting in your body, what are these things doing to you? And is it causing any negative effects? And is it causing an extra stress on your body?
Yeah.
Right. And that's a good segue too, Kerri, to talk about the challenge of practitioners bringing this up to their patients. How can we empower patients rather than instill fear? How can we open up the conversation because it is such a huge topic, just in terms of environmental medicine and those physical stressors on the body, not to mention mental emotional stressors. What kind of things can practitioners do to begin to educate their patient?
Well, so the first thing I would say is understand where your patient is at. Because as we're talking about stress, the last thing you want to do when you're talking about stress is to stress out your patient even more, right? Like if they're already dealing with so much, then you really have to understand what's already on their plate and what they can handle.
Mm,
And that really involves, listening to your patient, taking a really thorough history and having the conversation, what can you handle right now? Is this something that, we can talk about right now, or do you feel like you need to make some more gain in your health before we can, really have this serious conversation? But I would really start with some simple things, and I am a huge proponent of educating my patients. So really explaining why these things are important. And it's not, something that we have to be fearful of, but we definitely want to be empowered by this information.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the way we frame things as practitioners really goes a long way. And if we can be upbeat about it and we can explain that these things are modifiable, that always
mhm.
helps. So, really, really good
Absolutely.
reminder there. And what about, and we're talking about all sorts of kind of stressors in the environment, but I want to circle back to trauma a little bit and chronic disease, whether physical trauma or emotional trauma. Either way, what personal anecdote do you have from a clinical case really stuck with you in terms of that connection between trauma and chronic disease?
So I really have to take a personal story here, which I've
Sure.
been pretty open with sharing. But the reason why I've really entered my niche and deal with the pediatric population is because of my own children. I have twin boys who were 24-week preemies. And when you understand the amount of medical intervention and stress on a child that's born at 1 pound, you can really start to see the impacts that stress has on the body. Of course, there's so many other things a premature child needs to, develop and all of that. But really, that stress really manifested. Particularly in one of my children, and both of them really had a lot of gut issues, so many gut issues, getting out of the NICU, and then one of them developed, a condition called mast cell activation syndrome, and, this is something that, we're starting to learn and understand more about. We know that stress, like cortisol, can be a trigger for mast cell degranulation. So can trauma. You might see this in people that are dealing with mold illness too. Can develop mast cell activation syndrome. There are a lot of factors, but that was something that really led me down the road to focusing on how the body is really impacted by stress and what can I do to address that. And really, the first thing is to, try to remove any of those threats and those stressors from the environment to try to allow the body to understand that it's safe and it's okay to heal and to thrive. And some of those stressors are easier to remove than others, and it takes a really long time. This is not something that happens overnight. Um, but again, like just going back to, some of the basic factors that are stress on the body, removing infections, making sure that you can, minimize toxins and just really maintain that safe households for my children was a really, really big focus. So that's kind of my personal anecdote. But now that I've experienced it, I see it, and I see it everywhere, and I see how impactful stress is on the body physiologically.
How are they doing now?
Yeah. Oh, well, they will be 7 next week. They are
Wow.
growing and thriving, and um I think it's always a challenge, but I couldn't be happier with them and how far they've come.
Well, they could not be more fortunate to have you as a mother, especially with your background. So kudos to you. That's great.
Thank you.
100%. And so after being through such a journey with your kiddos, I'm wondering, you mentioned a little bit about the MCAS and working through the the things that you've done to make the home a bit safer. Were there any specific moments in time where it was a aha moment or a light bulb moment for you? One or two specific things that maybe you changed in the home or the diet or something where it just made such a difference for them?
Yeah, great question. The first is really the gut. Really treating the guts. When you're born that early, a lot of kids deal with infections, life-threatening infections, and so antibiotics are a common stay, and plus the immaturity of the guts and the microbiome. So I really started with the basics of treating the guts, eradicating SIBO, improving the microbiome, addressing leaky gut, and that made a significant difference. That really allowed them to be more resilient to other things in the environment. And I noticed that connection between, the gut and the brain, like the behaviors improved, immune system improved. So that was a really big connection. The other really big change was following a diet appropriate for that. So a low histamine diet was really the main diet that I followed. I also incorporated low lectins as well, and that made a significant difference. And then I made small changes. At nighttime, I turn off the Wi-Fi in my house. I can't do it during the day because we depend on it. But for 8 to 10 hours at night when we're sleeping, we don't need to be bombarded with all of those extra EMFs. So I made some small changes, and the really, really big one was mold. I found out I had mold in my house, and that led me down the road of mold and mast cell activation as another factor. And I live in South Florida. It's humid, it's wet, it's
Yeah.
a problem, and it's a problem in a lot of places. But those were really the big things that once I addressed them, I really saw significant changes.
That's so helpful. And those are three things that I think so many people contend with. You said poor gut health, EMFs, and mycotoxins. So ubiquitous. So thank you
Mhm.
for bringing those up. Such a good reminder there. And not only addressing an issue, but those being aware of those three things can really help in terms of preventing issues further down the road. So it's kind of a
Absolutely.
sustainable type of thing we want to be aware of going forward with working with patients and um, just the community at large being aware of these things. Really, really, really
Yeah.
important. So,
Yeah. I was just going to ask you how you went about sort of getting rid of that mold. I lived in Florida for a stint too, and that was a big issue. Yeah.
Well, let's just say I've lived in this house now for 2 years, and I've gone through 3 mold remediations. So I am very, very aware. And the thing is, now knowing that my son has mast cell activation, he's my canary in a coal mine. So I like whenever he's symptomatic, I know immediately that there's a mold issue, whether it's like a moldy food or something, like I know right away there's a problem. So it's
Wow.
not easy. I think the hardest thing has been finding like good people to help with the inspection and remediation process. Um, but it it's something that so many South Floridians or all Floridians and people all over the country deal with and don't really realize how much of a problem it is. So, I did do a
Yeah.
mycotoxin test. That was really helpful to, identify the extent of the problem. Um, but it's taken a little bit of time. It's a long, slow process to really get rid of those mycotoxins from the system.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So sorry, go please. I want to hear your
Well,
tangent.
I wanted to go into a little tangent about the gut because it's such a big, it's really one of the epicenters of our health, right? And if we understand the impact that stress has on the body, I love the very cliche and classic example of, what happens when we encounter a tiger, right? So we have our brain that senses different threats in the environment. So let's say it's sensing a tiger. And the hypothalamus will trigger a response because it's responsible for the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is branched into sympathetic and parasympathetic. And the sympathetic nervous system is really what's responsible for that fight or flight response. It's really fight, flight, or freeze, but we focus on fight or flight. So if we're encountering that tiger, our bodies are going to trigger a series of reactions to try to deal with that threat. And so what happens is our blood shunts away from the midsection of the body towards our extremities to get ready to run. And so think about what's happening. Our blood is shunting away from our midsection. So now we don't have that focus on our visceral organs, on our digestive tract. We're not focused on digestion and assimilation and excretion, even. We're focused on running away from that tiger. So that's a really important thing that I think is so often overlooked in when we're dealing with gut related issues. We see increases in blood pressure, increases in blood glucose levels to give us energy to flee. We have increased heart rate. All of these different physiological reactions happen. And that's good and that's normal. But it's when that state is chronic, right? The sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems like a seesaw. So when the sympathetic is activated, our parasympathetic is not. And that's the branch that's responsible for rest and digest. And so we want that to be primarily activated when we're eating, when we want to be focusing on healing our body. And so we need to learn how to shift off, how to, deal with acute stressors. That's fine. But in the long-term chronic state, how can we be more in a parasympathetic dominant nervous system? And that's really the focus of improving digestion. And it is, if you look at the 5R protocol and the fifth R is rebalance, it is touched upon, but I think it's so much easier for people sometimes to just take a pill or even change their diet than it is to, you know, change their lifestyle, to remove their stress, and to really tackle some of these serious issues head on. So that's something I think a lot of patients really benefit from as a first step before sometimes even dealing with that. Maybe even if someone's doing testing, for example, it's like you order the test and, maybe focusing on those mindfulness techniques and taking that initial time to implement some strategies to modulate stress so that you can improve hydrochloric acid secretion, enzyme secretion, improve motility in the gut, bile flow, all of these things that really are activated in that parasympathetic state. Um, and part of that is, from vagal nerve function. And part of it is, also feeding off of the health of the microbiome. But that's something that I think is just so overlooked. And a lot of patients kind of, it's just hard to grasp sometimes. And I don't think people really understand the impact that it has. So they kind of poo poo it. But I think if they really understood, they would take it a little bit more seriously.
It's beautiful. And I love the illustration you gave because I think for maybe some listeners who don't have that clinical background, it makes a lot of sense. But you kind of already answered a follow-up question I had, which is, clearly so many of us are walking around in this state of chronic stress. My question is, how would you recommend providers sort of broach this subject with patients when they don't even think it's an issue? And I know you mentioned maybe starting with the gut and the mindfulness techniques. But do you have any other advice for them on maybe how to help peel back that onion and make it a more conscientious thing for their patient?
Yeah. So I love data. Data is sometimes really helpful for a patient to see the impact of different things. So there are two tools that I like to use for that. One is using heart rate variability. And there are a lot of different monitors out there that can help to, assess your resilience and the impact of stress on your body. And the other is a simple questionnaire sometimes. How are you feeling? Something super objective, where people can keep track of their symptoms. And then, of course, I'll throw a third in there, which are functional tests, which you can also get a lot of data on. But I think when people see data and they see how it's impacting their body, they're much more motivated to make changes. It's not
Right.
some theoretical anymore. It's really, you see that this is something that is real. It's impacting you, and you can see the change when you implement some of these strategies to control that stress.
Makes a lot of sense. And hence the testing that you were referring to earlier.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, you can probably choose almost any functional medicine test and identify stress. Whether that like a stool test, for example, we know that stress can contribute to intestinal barrier dysfunction. So you might see like an elevated fecal zonulin. It can lead to low levels of beneficial commensals like bifidobacterium and lactobacilli, and increased levels of some different opportunistic bacteria like E. coli and enterobacteria. You also might see changes in secretory IgA. And you can also see some other changes in the stool as well. Low levels of enzymes, for example, with compromised digestion. So, that's a big one where you can identify stress. But I mean, honestly, you can go through any pattern. If you're doing hormones testing and you see high cortisol levels, like that's a really big red
Mm.
flag that you need to focus on some lifestyle techniques to monitor your health. Um, Hormone testing, you might see low levels of certain sex hormones. That's a really big impact on the hormonal system. You can see low levels of progesterone, for example, due to the pregnenolone steal. The body is really stealing that pregnenolone to form cortisol at the expense of progesterone. And I love looking at these pathways. Like, I love the science and the biochemistry of all of it. So just as much as it's helpful for the patients to see that data, I love to also see that data. Thyroid hormones, you might see, compromised thyroid function, low levels of T3 and T4, maybe high reverse T3. Neurotransmitter testing, of course, because a lot of the stress response involves, think about the HPA axis, right? It's the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, which is activated during states of stress. And so the adrenals pump out cortisol, but they also pump out epinephrine. And so the catecholamines are often increased. And so if you see high epinephrine on a neurotransmitter test, that's a really big red flag that someone's dealing with stress. There's another pathway on the neurotransmitter test that I love to look at too. It's called the tryptophan steal. And it's where the body, instead of using tryptophan to form serotonin, and then serotonin, of course, can form melatonin. And so, plays a really big role in sleep and mood and behavior. Instead of going down that pathway, the body can steal that tryptophan for another pathway called the kynurenine pathway, which can form a lot of neurotoxic intermediates and, a lot of different compounds that may actually be harmful for the nervous system. So the body does a lot of stealing and a lot of shifting to compensate for the stress response, it's really adaptable, and it's pretty cool that it has the ability to do that. It's just, again, if it's chronic, like at what expense is that happening? At your sex hormone expense, at your neurotransmitter expense, at your gut health expense. And when you start to add all of these up together, you can really paint a pretty clear clinical picture. And I'm sure a lot of providers have some examples that they can think of a patient that comes in and they're dealing with poor digestion and poor sleep, and some low thyroid or any combination of anything I just mentioned is actually pretty common. And if we think about the underlying factors in all of those things, it's stress. And so stress really is a root cause factor for a lot of dysfunction in the body.
I love that
Wow.
you mentioned dysfunction, Kerri. I mean, versus pathology. Once we rule out pathology, stress really is at the root of so many of these issues. And oftentimes I find exactly what you said, high cortisol, low sex hormones. It confirms an issue that we already suspect. We, meaning the patient and the provider, oftentimes. But it's a great incentive for the patient to be more compliant. And I think it also helps providers really have a patient who is not only compliant, but patient, right? Like the patient is going to be patient, hopefully, because it's a process. There's a process for them to get to this point. It's going to be a process to reverse it. Just as a reminder, maybe for practitioners who are just getting into functional medicine, integrative medicine, it's oftentimes such a process to address these things because you're coming at it from so many different angles, as you said, gut health and hormones and emotional health. It's really complex. So, but I find that the labs are very motivating from an objective standpoint.
Yeah,
Mm,
you can't
understand
argue
better.
with data, with numbers. I mean, it's
Mm,
it's really good
yeah.
information to have. And it's also important to, when you think about like a lot of the protocols that we have out there to treat gut issues and hormonal issues, we all have our protocols to, support digestion and all of that. But, really it's a lot of these are dealing with the side effects of stress. So don't forget to address that piece. And, it doesn't have to be a last step. It really can be one of the first things that you focus on because it might make your job easier in dealing with everything else. You might not need to have your patient on the protocol as long or on, as many supplements if they're taking on some of the responsibility to improve their health in that way.
Mm. All right, Kerri. So take us to Kerri Stress Busting School. I want to know what you do on the day to day when you encounter stress, like we all do. What are your best ways to sort of minimize that stress?
So, I am human. I am not perfect. I know a lot about this, but it's one of those things that like stress management is a practice and it really takes showing up every single day and incorporating mindfulness every single day. So, one of the things that I love doing and I'm pretty consistent with is meditation. And I like to do this first thing in the morning because it sets me up for the whole day. So I get on the right foot. If I had a funky night or bad dreams or whatever, or stressful day coming up, I can really set my day off straight. So and if I do live in Florida, so whenever I have the opportunity, I do like to meditate outside and ground myself. So I'll often do it in the sand or just in my garden. So that's something that I really love and I'm consistent with. Um, and then I kind of take it day by day. I really just try to be present and just engage in mindfulness. I think it's just so easy to get caught up in the future and the past and the worries of everything that's going on. So I really just try to focus on mindfulness and whether that's playing with my kids or eating, just really being present in the moment.
Mhm.
Um, so simple things. I really don't do anything extravagant, but those are some of the things that really work for me. And I think it's important to find something that works for you so that you're consistent with it, because it's
Mm,
not the things that you do once in a while that matter. It's the things that you do every single day that really add up.
I love that. And I love that it's so practical. Meditation has changed my life for sure. So I can vouch for that. But yeah, what you're saying is things that you can build into your lifestyle and do every day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's different for everyone. So meditation works for you, but that might not be someone's jam, and they might do better going to a yoga class, or you know then I think it's also important to address that there might be some patients too that might need more intense therapy, right? Like sometimes that's just not enough to kind of snap them out of that state of trauma or that dysregulated nervous system.
Mhm.
And there are some other things that are really helpful, and that's where things like vagus nerve stimulation can be really helpful. And there are certain, tools and techniques to stimulate the vagus nerve, certain devices. That's actually one that I was talking about before that I've been super excited about, discovering the role that certain vibrations can have in stimulating the vagus nerve. So I got a a vibration device. I need to be careful how I say that. um, and that's something that I use with my kids because it's kind of passive. It's not something that requires as much mindfulness. So that's a really cool tool for pediatrics.
Mm.
Um, and then there's another program another kind of area, which is limbic system retraining, which is also a really fascinating area. And this really has to do with those long-term changes and effects on the brain, and how retraining the brain can help our body just stop perceiving that threat and that stress. And so there are different programs like the Gupta program or DNRS, or ANS Rewire, which can be a great first step for certain patients, especially ones that are extremely hypersensitive. I kind of talked about removing the threat as a first step, but for patients that are really hypersensitive, they might not be able to tolerate a detox protocol or an eradication protocol for infections. And so that's where some of these other tools might come into play as a first step to kind of balance their body a little bit more. And then you can move on to those next stages.
Oh, very helpful.
All right. So, and you talk about, I love how you said there are people who might be more sensitive. They might need a little bit more, right? And so there's might be certain populations or communities who are more vulnerable to stress, trauma due to societal and environmental factors. Do you have experience with this? Is there anything you want practitioners to be mindful of in terms of those communities?
Yeah. I would say that there are probably a lot more of those people than I think a lot of us realize. And they tend to be pretty complex, but definitely hypersensitive. So a lot of people that are dealing with Lyme's disease, for
Mhm.
example, or a chronic mold sickness, they definitely fall into this category. But really, I think a lot of people too that are just chronic, like they've been dealing with these health issues that have gone unanswered for a really, really long time. And so the body's just been in this state of threat, and often in the state of what we call the cell danger response, which is just this vicious cycle where the body just continues to perceive this stress and contributes to a whole host of different effects and changes in the body and the mitochondria. Really, a lot of these people require a lower and slower approach and would probably benefit from more mindfulness and nervous system rebalancing to help them just even be able to tolerate the protocols and some of the things that really they do need to kind of take on.
Right. Yeah. And I imagine referrals occur a lot, depending on the complexity of the case. This was something that came through your questionnaire, and thank you for filling that out. This conventional merry-go-round, as you say, it's easy to refer, and we need to refer as needed. That's why we have specialists, of course. Um, and not but and also realizing when referrals are in order, maybe in the meantime, maybe when we're trying to set up that referral, are there things that we can do in terms of the vagus nerve stimulator? Are there things in office? Maybe just having them come in more often, right, for more frequent visits. I know I used to have patients who just they would like to come in more frequently, right? Just to kind of chat, have a sense of community, more regular check-ins. I find. Can you speak to that in terms of maybe what do you mean by the conventional merry-go-round? What is a solution to that from your perspective?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I love that name, and it's something that I kind of would describe our experience with my children and my family when we would be pushed from one specialist to another, and it's like, okay, I'm done with the gut. All the other symptoms that you're dealing with, go to the next specialist, and it's like, but the gut has a nervous system, and the gut has immune function, and the gut has all of these there's no separation in the body. And the specialist model really becomes problematic when you segment everything, because then there's no one that's really looking at the entirety of it all. And, even just from today's conversation, just kind of bringing it home to stress, it's like, imagine someone who's dealing with the effects of stress, right? And they could be going to all of those different specialists. You can be going to a GI doctor for your bloating and reflux. You can go to a cardiologist for your arrhythmias or high blood pressure, or whatever it is. And it's like nobody is really looking at this full picture and understanding what are the dots that we can connect, what are the underlying root cause factors. And that's really where all of these providers in functional medicine are the key to these patients. It's the answer to their prayers, I think, because they really do have the skills and the ability to be really good generalists as well as specialists in certain areas, but generalists in the sense that they really understand that integrative aspect of the body, how everything is connected, and how some of these root cause factors manifest in terms of symptoms and disease state. So I think it really just is a good reminder for us that, in functional medicine, what we do is a great example. And, referrals are still important. Specialists are still extremely important. There is absolutely a place for them in our medical system. But I think a lot gets missed when we stick to just that model.
I like
Yeah.
what you said too about the functional model. Even though you go to a provider that practices functional medicine, they may be an expert in one niche, but they at least understand that the body is a whole and that everything is connected. So I think that is really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And hopefully those integrative practitioners and functional practitioners, they are going to be more willing to coordinate care with the specialists who are
Mhm.
necessary to have on that team. So we really can approach those complicated cases as a team. That's kind
Yeah.
of the ideal, in my opinion, at least. Have those back and
Yeah,
forth.
100%. And I think they respond really well to research. It's like, when you print out a study and share it with the doctors, they tend to be more receptive to this concept or idea that they weren't taught in medical school, but there is data and there is literature on it. And so I kind of sometimes use that literature as like the go between between some of the specialists and, to help coordinate patient care.
Absolutely. And just to
Mhm.
add real quick, I think we're wrapping things up, Carrie, but to make it clear to providers, maybe you are working in a primary care model and maybe you refer out for acupuncture sometimes, of course, physical therapy, counseling as needed. But I hope as a collective medical community, we're working towards having a one-stop shop. If we can have everything in one place, I think we're really serving patients um, to the highest level. So having the in-house body work and counseling. There are some centers like this. I don't know if you have experience with, integrative centers like this, but they do exist, and I think it's fantastic. And again, it makes it easier for patients to just stop by, have an appointment with whichever practitioner they find they need to consult with that day. Um, and it's so important because the stress of tackling, like you said, before even jumping into a protocol for Lyme, maybe we need to consider the stress management as a foundational piece, like diet, before we even start to treat those complex conditions.
I would love to see centers like that pop up. I mean, it's
They do
something that
exist.
they do exist. They are still far and few in between.
I
But
agree.
it really is an ideal model. And yeah, we do have our specialties. So having a team to support each other in what we do best is a brilliant idea.
Absolutely. Well, we covered a lot today. Was there anything else that you had, Jen, before we jump into our conclusion and our rapid fire questions for Kerri?
No, as always, I always learn so much. I'm just appreciative of all your expertise. But yeah, let's hit those rapid fire questions.
Let's
All
do it.
right.
Okay. And before we do that, just as an overview, again, went over so much. I learned so much. We What I really took away, Kerri, was again thinking about stress management as a first step. Because of course, as a naturopathic doctor myself, I'm always assessing for stress and reminding patients whatever you find calming, right? Whether it be meditation or breathing or walking outside or exercise, acupuncture, etc. Using that really first before even tackling diet, to be very specific, before even giving dietary recommendations, because that in and of itself can be so stressful. It can be very triggering for certain patients, just from my perspective and experience, getting down the stress management to be really, really solid first. If we have the time and we have the patient coming in for frequent checkups, that was really enlightening for me to kind of have you frame it that way. So thank you for
Mhm.
that. We talked about prevention, the stress surrounding trauma, but the stress of the trauma, the stress dealing with the trauma. And so all of that is really, really useful, and especially the physiology behind it so we can understand and connect the dots. So, with that said, thank you so much for being here. We're going to lighten it up a little bit with our rapid fire questions. First one being, after all this talk of these environmental risk factors and all these stressors in our life, there's the phrase everything in moderation, right? So, what is your guilty pleasure?
Oh, I would probably it's not complex. I love my coffee and I love staying up late, but I will
Ooh,
overdo the coffee and I will stay up very, very late. And so
and
that's where the
I love it.
moderation.
yeah,
Yeah, it
Yeah,
really is.
I can
I love it.
relate. Yes. Totally. And it feels so good, especially so my boyfriend, our schedules are staggered, so he'll come home late and I want to spend time with him. So I can definitely relate to that, wanting to stay up late and savor the
Mhm.
coffee, have the coffee before the late night little
Yeah.
slumber party, if you will,
It's like a
all at
sense of
once.
rebellion a little bit, and, I wanna feel like I have 3 kids. I wanna feel like I have a night to myself, and sometimes I just get a little out of hand, so
And then sometimes we pay
Yeah.
for it the next day.
that's exactly right.
But what about if you could eat one food for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Ooh, one food for the rest of my life. I would probably say it's a hard question. I really love healthy food. Like, I really genuinely love healthy food. Like, my husband looks at me downing a salad and he's like, "Oh, that must be torturous." Like, "No, I really love it." So, I don't know. I'd probably say, like, some sort of like stir fry or salad. I don't know. That's super boring, but I something that
I think that's smart.
Something
because then
along
it's a
those
variety
lines.
of foods. You're getting a variety
Yes.
in that.
Yes,
Yeah,
and I'll
that's
feel
right.
good for the rest of my life. So there you go.
Brilliant.
All right. For your last question, Kerri, what are you reading right now? What's on your nightstand?
Ooh, on my nightstand. Let's see. I have it right here next to me, and it's Healing Complex Children with Homeopathy. And that's been like my new rabbit hole is using homeopathy and learning about homeopathy as a tool to treat chronic disease. And sometimes it's really just the icing on the cake for a lot of complex patients. So that's been really cool. And I have a bunch of like cool personal anecdotes of how it's really affected my family's life. So that's been a really cool experience to learn about that, because that's not something that I was taught in school. So this really is just, a bit of a passion of mine right now.
Maybe a part 2 for us.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'd love
I'll
that.
learn a little bit more before I talk about that. But
Whenever you're ready, let's come back.
Well,
Perfect.
you are obviously a lover of learning. Your expertise shined in this conversation. I can't thank you enough for being here. I know I enjoyed it. I'm sure our listeners did too. So again, just personally thanking you for being here and thanking our listeners too. Make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments if there is a topic that you would like to hear us talk about. So thank you again, Kerri, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks so much for having me. I love talking with you guys today.
Thank you so much for being here today. Don't forget to leave us a review and subscribe so we can continue to pay it forward together. And remember, the key to longevity is knowledge. Keep learning, growing, and tuning in to the Vibrant Wellness podcast to discover the latest insights and strategies for optimal health. Join us again next week. Just a reminder, this podcast is for educational and informational purposes and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The views expressed by guests and host are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy of Vibrant Wellness. As always, consult your healthcare provider before applying any recommendations that you heard here today.